I guess the neatest way to start this is where everyone else would, the day the pergola went up. But we're not going to do the polite version. We're doing the one where I spill everything over lukewarm coffee and a salad that never tastes the same after you know who you are. My name's Maya Lynn. I live on Cedar Ridge Lane. For 10 years, it was a neighborhood where people waved, mowed, and pretended no one asked about their mortgage. Then Douglas Hale became HOA president. Douglas is the kind of man who sorts his mail by typeface, and who trims his azaleas with the meticulousness of someone who will later tell you neighborhood standards mean something higher than basic decency. We all knew him. Former engineer, current volunteer enforcement zealot. He liked order. He liked compliance. He liked being the one who decided what curb appeal meant. He also liked being the person you blamed when your summer party got a noise complaint. The pergola? It belonged to Ruth Morales, a kind woman who could bake the kind of oatmeal cookies that made you forgive municipal taxes. She'd wanted a simple wooden structure to hang string lights and watch the kids play. She didn't want a neighbor war. She wanted a place where margaritas tasted better, because they were outdoors. Instead, she built the thing in 2 sunlit weekends, and the neighborhood began breathing through filtered air. That's when the notices started, hand-delivered, of course, because messages that look official with a wax seal font are harder to ignore. Douglas cited the rule about architectural consistency, which is a phrase that sounds sensible until you've seen the variety of gutters on our street. The interesting part is not that a complaint was made, it's that the complaint arrived with signatures in a hand that matched the HOA minutes. Odd, right? Nobody accused anybody yet. We were still in the polite phase, passive-aggressive gardenia-scented flyers shoved under doors. But the first real crack wasn't the pergola itself, it was how people lined up. You'd think a small wooden structure would be a neutral thing, plenty of shade to go around. Instead, it became a flag under which old grievances gathered. The paint job from 2 houses down, the barking dog that only barked at certain people, the for sale sign someone put up 3 years ago and never took down. Suddenly, community standards felt less like a collective idea and more like an argument about who got to speak for the neighborhood. And that's when I stopped being able to look at mailboxes the same way. It's funny how a new mailbox can catalyze suspicion. When Greg Harper moved in across from my driveway, he brought a mailbox shaped like a miniature lighthouse and a demeanor that smelled faintly of freshly ironed shirts. Greg was youngish, sharp-eyed, always in motion, and he liked things done correctly. He'd read the HOA covenants, cover to cover, I imagined, and he told us with a semi-smile that he planned on being a good neighbor. That's neighbor speak for someone who will notice everything on a Tuesday and complain on a Wednesday. The first complaint he made was about Ruth's potted succulents. They're encroaching into the easement, he said at the next barbecue, which is where normal people talk about grilling temperatures and weird toenail fungus while pretending the mail hasn't been an instrument of harassment. The succulents were, to my eyes, decorative and harmless. Greg's eyes, however, had a way of turning flora into violations. He handed me a photo with yard tape measured into the frame like evidence from a spy movie. I should say, I liked Greg. He seemed to be the kind of person who would help you change a flat tire at dusk. But liking someone and trusting them are different. He started attending HOA meetings, and he had suggestions. Improvements, he said, like better enforcement, standardized shutter colors, not a euphemism, and stricter rules on non-permanent structures. He was careful with his words. The first time he mentioned the pergola in public, he called it an unapproved addition. It was the kind of phrase that would otherwise have skipped us all. Said with the right pause, it sounded much worse. Douglas predictably loved Greg. New blood, eager, precise. It makes sense. Douglas looks for competence he can control. They began trading emails that read like a duet. One line of policy, one line of agreement. Meanwhile, the rest of us caught the eddies from their tide. We formed our little camps. The people who thought Ruth's pergola was charming. The people who thought the HOA should be a lawyer's dream. And the people who didn't want to get involved. Most people, including me at first, preferred to watch the politicking from the safety of our porches, sip our iced tea, and pretend no one's property values were out to get them. But the porch is a thin shield. It cracks. The first formal HOA meeting felt like entering a courtroom where everyone knew the judge personally. We sat on folding chairs in the community room, whose carpet I'm pretty sure hosts all our stories, and Douglas opened with the usual script. We want to keep Cedar Ridge Lane a place we're all proud of. Translation: we want Cedar Ridge to look like a magazine spread, and we will make sure it does, whether you want to or not. Ruth sat 3 rows back. She had a water bottle, and her hands shook just slightly, the way they do when someone is making themselves brave. I watched Greg take notes like a man who would later use them as props in a play called Persistence. The meeting began with mundane items: budget approval, landscaping bids. Then an item at the bottom of the agenda: unapproved pergola on Lot 12. That's when the rules became alive. Douglas read the covenant language, and then read it again, slower, as if reading it once allowed for interpretation, and twice made it law. He talked about precedent and neighborhood harmony. Greg chimed in with a procedural suggestion: a vote to require removal pending retroactive approval. It sounds simple until you realize this sort of vote is a weapon. If you remove an already built structure, you're essentially rewriting lives, taking down plans and fairy lights and the place where a grandmother sat with lemonade. Ruth defended herself in a way that made my throat tight. She brought pictures, before and after the pergola, and letters from neighbors who liked it. Her voice was small but steadied by the thing she'd built. Douglas, though, had a way of asking questions that suggested other motives. "Were you aware," he'd ask, "that other neighbors might find it obtrusive?" He wasn't just concerned with sightlines. He was testing allegiances. The vote was supposed to be administrative, but it felt moral. People who had nodded in passing suddenly felt obliged to be the arbiter of taste. The meeting ended without resolution. The board took it under advisement. But the climate had changed. What was administrative became personal. After the meeting, people clustered in the parking lot, trading conjectures as if they were ballots for some civic opera. Gossip does strange things in a small space. It makes saints suspicious and makes reasonable people feel like they must choose sides or be chosen. Complaints have a way of breeding complaints like mold. After the pergola vote's stalemate, another vector opened: pets. It started with Samir Patel's golden retriever, Archie, who liked to sing at 6 a.m. He was a loving dog, the kind that bounces when you come home and smells faintly of whatever commandment you've forgotten. Archie loved the whole street, which is a charming thing, until that love is vocal. Someone, no one would admit who, left a typed note on Samir's door. Excessive barking between 11 p.m. and 6 a.m. is in violation of the quiet hours policy, it said, in a font that suggested officialdom. Samir took it personally, like anybody would. He's a teacher and works late at night grading, and the idea that his dog was a suburban nemesis stung. He responded by putting up a handwritten sign on his front lawn. Archie apologizes for any inconvenience. He's not trying to be a menace. Please enjoy his tale. That sign, of course, provoked another response. Someone taped a copy of the covenants to a telephone pole near Samir's house with quiet hours highlighted in yellow. It begins to feel ridiculous to recount, and yet each tiny escalation pulled on the next like a row of dominoes. The petty acts, notes, signs, highlighted clauses, gave people permission to believe their grievances were both moral and communal. There were other small acts of revenge that summer. One neighbor whose garden gnomes had been rearranged by an unknown hand posted a passive-aggressive list of acceptable lawn decor. A teenage kid, I later learned, had been paid to mow a lawn at midnight, purely to rattle a particular homeowner who liked his grass precise. These weren't big things. They were mean and annoying and designed to make a life feel small. I confess, I participated. Maybe not with midnight lawn mowers or rearranged gnomes, but I left a single, anonymous complaint about a faded flag that had hung for months on the porch of a woman who'd been quietly wearing grief like an invisible coat. I rationalized it, not to myself but as a civic duty. Looking back, that ticketed complaint tastes like glue in my mouth. It was nothing. It felt like everything. I remember Ruth the night she came to my porch after the third formal notice. She had been summoned by a letter that used the HOA's letterhead in careful legal language. She looked smaller than the pergola. "They want me to remove it immediately," she said, hands in her cardigan pockets like she might find something to steady herself there. "They say it's an unapproved structure and a blight on the vista." You could tell she'd read the letter twice and chosen her words carefully. I baked her brownies, which is the domestic equivalent of offering a bandage. Ruth didn't seem interested in knowing who'd signed the complaint. She wanted to know if anyone would show up on a Saturday to sit under the pergola and make it less of a statute of controversy and more of a home. Some people did, with lawn chairs and coolers and an aura of quiet defiance. Others watched from their windows like you watch a small television show you can't stop criticizing. What got politicized was the permitting process itself. Greg and Douglas began to insist that everything on our properties required approval. Even temporary trellises, even kids, tree houses. They pushed for a form, retroactive structure approval, that read less like a form and more like a confession. It required measurements, materials, paint samples, and 3 neighbor signatures. The rhetoric changed from "let's keep things nice" to "we must enforce equity," which is a phrase that sounds noble until you see who gets listed as the gatekeepers. Ruth tried to comply. She took photos, bought cedar instead of pine even though it cost more, and she submitted a form that included neighbors, names she thought might vouch for her. That's how this thing slices. The requirement of 3 signatures becomes a way to force social capital into a ledger. People who could get their neighbors' signatures had leverage. People who couldn't got judged for being isolated. The irony is, the pergola was fine. It was built level, was it not? Its beams were secured. The lights were strung with the kind of care some of us reserve for holiday displays. Yet what we were arguing about was far less architectural than human. Who had the right to decide? Who could be trusted to be fair? And how much power you felt entitled to wield? Yard signs are nothing in most places. A rectangle stuck in the grass. Here, they were declarations of identity and cause. Someone put up a small sign supporting a local candidate 3 avenues over, and suddenly the street felt split like a bean sprout in 2. People who once shared lemonade recipes started texting each other with screenshots of these signs, as if evidence of political treachery. Ruth's friends put up a tiny "Support Local Gathering Spaces" sign next to her mailbox. Someone else, someone with time and a flair for PR, circulated a professionally made placard that read, "Protect our property values, follow the covenants." It was the artful escalation, the kind where someone spends money to make something look official and civilized while stoking fear. Douglas had a knack for language. He'd talk about visual clutter and community aesthetics, and sound like he was offering salvation. Greg, bless him, would post long, carefully reasoned messages on the neighborhood forum about the need for uniformity. It's maddening because their arguments read like civics lectures. They were reasonable in tone and terrifying in implication. If you accept that the neighborhood must look a certain way, you start to accept the enforcement as a necessary evil. There were slights, too. The woman on Maple who refused to sign Ruth's form came over with a casserole but not a signature. She said she liked Ruth personally but feared the precedent. Another neighbor, Naomi, who'd always been one to throw block parties, posted a neutral message and then, later, an apology. It's exhausting watching people weigh the cost of standing up, because fear of social reprisal is quieter but heavier than legal threat. The signs became a battlefield. People swapped them in the night, like pieces in some low-stakes espionage game. One morning, to everyone's delight, someone planted a fake "for sale" sign in front of Douglas's house with a listing that mentioned "Pride in Enforcement." Douglas removed it with that thin smile he uses when he is both vexed and amused. Someone laughed, then realized the laughter had a sour edge. Humor only goes so far when your neighbor's mailbox is a flashpoint. Voting is supposed to be anonymous and solemn, but in a small HOA it feels like voting with sticky notes. The big move came when Douglas proposed a bylaw change to streamline approvals, a change that would give more discretionary power to the board for minor structural variances. On its face, it was bureaucratic cleanup. But anyone paying attention could see the vector. Minor structural variances could include pergolas, awnings, and even decorative fences. The night of the vote, people came with agendas tucked into their pockets like receipts. Greg organized a small coalition, people who'd benefit from a more regulated street, or who simply believed in rigid systems. They brought cookies and charts and a spreadsheet that listed instances of non-compliance over the past 5 years. Charts are persuasive. Numbers feel like truth. Something odd happened in that vote, though. A stack of proxy votes turned up, and they were all suspiciously neat, typed, signed in the same ballpoint ink. People started whispering about how some proxies were collected at a block barbecue, how one man in particular offered help with filling out forms for elderly neighbors. That same man later confessed to forging a signature to get a relative's vote. It was the sort of admission that feels like a confession and an indictment at once. After the vote, there was an appeal, then a meeting to rescind the vote, then lawyers on standby. The board claimed procedural integrity. A small group of us argued that the proxies had been manipulated. Douglas insisted everything was above board. Greg had disappeared from the pub that night and later texted that he, quote, trusted the process. It's funny how trust contracts when you discover the contracting party was inflating the ledger. The result was a temporary victory for the regulation camp, not because the residents truly supported the bylaw, but because the inertia of officialdom is heavy. Once a formality is in place, inertia compounds. The neighbors who'd wanted to keep things as they were found themselves boxed in by paperwork and a new clause that, if enforced, would turn small personal projects into legal headaches. We learned a lesson that week. Procedures are a kind of power move, soft, plausible, and quietly damaging. Secrets began behaving like pets that chewed through walls. We discovered, through a half-accident, that Douglas had benefited from a contractor who happened conveniently to receive several HOA landscaping contracts shortly after Douglas took over. The contractor was courteous and efficient, and his trucks smelled like fresh wood and results. The link. Douglas's brother-in-law sat on the contractor's payroll as an administrative consultant. It wasn't illegal, not strictly. It was just the sort of thing that makes neighborhoods sleepy with envy. People were annoyed, and annoyance breeds storytelling. The forum lit up with theory. Did Douglas favor that contractor because he liked the job? Because of loyalty, because of monetary advantage? No one wanted to be the person to say conflict of interest out loud, because that's a loaded phrase. Once you say it, you enter into a formal complaint that eats up time and energy. Some neighbors did file a complaint, others whispered about the risk of lawsuits. Greg suggested a formal audit. Others thought it too severe. I, who'd been watching all of this like someone watching a slow train wreck, learned more than I wanted to know about the guy who mowed Douglas's lawn free of charge and the neighbor who'd gotten a bluestone path installed with suspicious timing. Meanwhile, alliances formed in odd pairs. Naomi, the block party queen, suddenly spent her afternoons playing chess with Douglas on the community bench. Greg, who started as Douglas's protege, began to distance himself, claiming he had, quote, stepped back to observe. Observation is a great hiding place. Where you stand in a story is a function of what you say about your motives. And motives are slippery. People who fought for the pergola did not fight as one. Some wanted to protect Ruth. Some wanted to preserve a way of living. Others wanted to be contrarian. We learned something about human beings in these weeks. Secrets give people a power they'll use on principle or petty grudge. And when someone like Douglas has both the perception of integrity and the flexibility to interpret covenants to his liking, it's easy to confuse the voice of governance with the personal desire to control. Retaliation in our neighborhood was more about embarrassment than injury. Someone started leaving envelopes on porches with single printed pages, no signatures, no return addresses, detailing violations in a tone so clinical it felt surgical. They listed paint chips, trash can placement, and one entry that made the community laugh and then quietly look away. Excessive sympathy. That last one made no sense until someone realized it was about a woman who had been grieving and received too much neighborly condolence, which, apparently, can be perceived as a nuisance if you're twisted enough to make it so. There were nights where sprinklers came on at odd hours right after someone had complained. Someone else found a lawn ornament moved. We had a neighbor who specialized in leaving passive-aggressive birthday cards with post-it notes stuck to them. The funny thing about being petty is that it gives a person a sense of agency without real consequence. You can flick a match and watch people dance. The cost is moral, not legal, so you don't always feel the burn yourself. Then there was the incident with the mail. A batch of HOA notices went missing before a major vote, and the mailbox in question belonged to a woman who liked roses and had a cat that thought it was a dog. The missing mail meant some people didn't receive notification and thus could not participate. We suspected, of course, that certain volunteers who'd been aggressive in their compliance campaigns had motives to suppress dissent, but suspicion, in a small place, is a combustible material. The tension ratcheted up when anonymous posters began emailing neighbors with private correspondences printed and highlighted. I received one such packet myself. An edited transcript of a conversation I'd had about the pergola with Naomi, printed in a way that made me look like I had urged people to escalate. The effect was chilling. Suddenly, private words had the force of public testimony. We became careful not just in what we said at meetings but in what we whispered on porches. And every small revenge added to a ledger that none of us wanted to balance. The emotional cost, mistrust, paranoia, the desire to look innocent while being complicit, began to exceed the value of any yard improvement. That's when you start to see people change. Folks who once gave you zucchinis now avoid your eye in the grocery store aisle. The neighborhood's social currency deflated, like a badly repaired tire. The day I realized how much this had cost us was ordinary in its cruelty. It was a Saturday. Ruth's granddaughter had been practicing violin in the backyard under the pergola because stringed music carries like bright laundry. A couple of neighbors who had always kept to themselves came over with lemonade and donuts and sat under the pergola, and for a few hours the neighborhood wasn't a tribunal, it was a respite. Kids ran through sprinklers, and for a second I could see the old Cedar Ridge, the one where people borrowed sugar and borrowed a cup of time. Then someone called about a tree limb overhanging a sidewalk 2 blocks away. It was neither emergency nor urgent, but Douglas's name appeared in the chain of messages, and before I knew it, someone had circulated a photo. Someone else questioned whether the tree was a safety hazard, and the tranquil scene behind Ruth's wood beams felt watched. It was small and stupid and ruinous. That afternoon, Naomi, who had been friendly with almost everyone, cornered me by the community mailbox. "Maya," she said, lowering her voice like she'd learned a secret from another planet, "have you noticed a change in yourself? I mean, since all this started." She wasn't asking who I supported in the pergola dispute. She was asking about me, the person I'd become. And I saw it. I had become the kind of neighbor who noticed the wrongness in others more readily than the right. I'd started cataloging transgressions in my head. the way people collect coins. I'd written the complaint about the flag and felt justified. But watching Ruth's granddaughter smile as music ricocheted in the warm air, I felt a heavy, unfamiliar ache in my chest for the community as it was, and for the part I'd played in making it smaller. Empathy had become a scarce resource. People on opposing sides began to speak as if the other person were not just mistaken but a threat. That day I understood that the real damage wasn't to property. It was to the likelihood that we could still inhabit this place with gentleness. The pergola was not a piling of carpentry. It was an opportunity for generosity. We had turned generosity into a legal issue. Lawyers arrived, as they always do, when civility can't hold the fort. The first was an attorney who offered mediation as a reasonable, low-cost alternative. "It's for the health of the community," she said. The second was a heavy-set litigator who smelled faintly of aftershave and certainty. He was hired by a faction that wanted the pergola removed immediately. Legal letters began to look like another language in which people disguised their feelings as claims. Ruth was terrified. She had receipts and photos and a neighbor's signature or two, but she did not have enough legal ammo to fight a drawn-out case. The thought of defending a backyard structure in court while paying fees for a lawyer ate at her. She did what anyone would do. She organized a fundraiser at the pergola. Not just to raise money, but to create a public record of the space's value. It was a risky move. It made the pergola more public, which was precisely what the opposition feared and the supporters needed. Mediation was surreal. We sat around a table with an impartial person who gently asked us to describe our feelings. We did. The person representing the litigation firm spoke with a level of detachment that was unnerving. He didn't so much argue facts as reframe the narrative. "This is about precedent," he said. Like that explained everything. He wasn't wrong. Precedent was the currency of the issue, but hearing them repackage neighborly warmth into legalese felt obscene. What the mediation couldn't reconcile was trust. Agreements can be written, but people change. The mediator recommended a path forward: conditional retroactive approval with a covenant attached, and a small fine to be allocated toward neighborhood beautification. It was a compromise on paper, but a neighbor's sense of being violated can't always be bought off by a plaque. Ruth accepted because she couldn't afford litigation, and I respected her for it. What I did not respect was how some folks celebrated the compromise as if it were a moral victory, rather than the practical salvage of a friendship. Secrets have a way of unspooling and leaving you holding a thread. Someone leaked an email that Douglas had written before he became president, an email that revealed a certain disdain for what he called laissez-faire neighbors. He'd written, in a tone that read like a manifesto, about creating a legacy of a well-ordered street. People started to see him not as the impartial guardian he claimed to be, but as someone with a plan. The biggest blow came when we learned Douglas had, in private, spoken with a developer about community beautification plans that would include uniform fencing and standardized signage. The developer was friendly and had a taste for symmetry. It smelled like progress, which is another word for change that benefits certain people. Douglas defended himself, of course. He talked about civic responsibility and the long-term value of careful planning. But when you learn that the man who enforces rules on your hedges is quietly negotiating with someone who stands to profit from those rules, the air changes. Greg's role shifted in an interesting way. He publicly denounced any kind of collusion, which made him look principled. But later, a package surfaced emails between Greg and a couple of homeowners in which he suggested a plan for legislative changes that would benefit their own home improvements. It painted him in a contradictory light, purist on one occasion, transactional on the next. I watched neighbors who once trusted Douglas cross the street rather than ask him about anything. It's extraordinary how quickly respect curdles when you suspect a hidden motive. The pergola dispute had become a wedge, but the wedge hid something deeper, the hunger for control. We weren't just arguing about beams. We were scrapping over who gets to define the way we live. And once that's in question, everything else is collateral. The neighborhood fractured in small domestic ways that added up to the big picture of a community unraveling. Houses that had been on the market for months suddenly listed their features in new terms. Proximity to community center became, quote, distance from HOA interference. People who had once lent each other tools now consulted their lawyers before borrowing a ladder. The petty annoyances became the economy of our days. We lost some people. Ruth, exhausted by the process, decided to sell her place and move nearer to her kids. She left the pergola intact for the new owners, who, ironically, adored it and threw a welcome party under those same string lights. Greg put his house up for sale too. It turned out the man who liked rules didn't like being in a place where his rules made him enemies. He moved to a new development where regulations were stricter and compliance was evidently more satisfying. Those who remained had to decide if they wanted to keep fighting or pick up what was left. Naomi tried to keep the block party tradition alive, but fewer people came. The cake table sat smaller and the music softer. You could measure the damage in smaller ways: less mail swapped, fewer shared casseroles, less sweetness overall. For my part, I stopped being as quick to judge people by the complaint they filed. I'd seen what being right costs. That doesn't mean I forgave everything. I still think some actions were unnecessary and cruel, but I stopped seeing my neighbors as simple actors in a moral theater. They were complicated, with motives that included fear and rent and boredom and pride, which, after a while, makes you sadder than anything else. This is where I confess a few things. The first is that I wasn't neutral. I sat on the fence for appearances, but I did things, small things, that widened fissures. I left an anonymous suggestion once that painted a neighbor as neglectful. I helped circulate a petition because I was afraid of being the odd one out. Fear is an unattractive motive to admit, but truth is supposed to be ugly sometimes. I also confess I am partly responsible for making the story about winning instead of repairing. There's a moment early on where I wrote an opinion piece in our community newsletter about the meaning of neighborhood. It was heartfelt and a bit sanctimonious, and it read as if I had the moral high ground. I quoted things I shouldn't have and implied motives that weren't verified. People took it personally. The piece made the argument that we needed stricter standards to preserve quality of life, which is funny to me now because it's the same position I later opposed. Regret is a slow-burning thing. It lives in the way you avoid doors and postpone conversations. When Ruth left, I went to her house and sat in the pergola once when she wasn't there. I ate an orange and felt ridiculous. The wood smelled like summer. I realized that the warmth people had shared under those beams had been traded for procedural victory. and a kind of hollow righteousness. The pergola remained, but it was a relic of a time when kindness could be the default. I also learned the value of names. When we reduced neighbors to violators or enforcers, they stopped being people. We'd all made mistakes. We'd all felt slighted. Admitting that we were mixed bags, capable of tender gestures and petty cruelties, was the first step toward picking up the pieces. Not everyone did. Some people dug in. Some people left. Others tried to rebuild. Slowly, like patching a fence in winter. Time softens things in ways that surprise you. The pergola still stands. The lights glow in summer, but fewer arguments circle it. Douglas retired from the board in a move that some people called graceful and others called tactical. He planted roses in front of his house and sometimes waves at passers-by. Greg sold his lighthouse mailbox and left a note saying he hoped Cedar Ridge would find its heart again. Naomi organizes a smaller, less raucous gathering each month with cookies and a playlist that leans soft. We are a changed neighborhood. People who left are replaced by newcomers who don't yet know our quarrels. That's both a mercy and a hazard. Newcomers bring fresh energy, but they also inherit the ledger of old grievances without always knowing its line items. I told you at the start I would tell the truth like a neighbor with nothing to lose, and here it is. The real wound wasn't the pergola, or the signs, or even the bylaws. It was the way we converted small acts of preference into moral decrees, and then used those decrees to wound each other. I keep a little stack of the anonymous notes that were left in my mailbox, yellowed, folded, sharp with language. Sometimes I read them and remember how small and ridiculous and, yes, human we were. What I want for Cedar Ridge is not paper harmony or a perfectly curated street. I want the sort of mess that includes neighborhood bake sales, awkward apologies, and kids who blast music too loud, and people who climb onto a porch to ask about a recipe. The ending is not tidy. Some people still roll their eyes when they see Ruth's pergola. Others sit beneath it and laugh. I know what I'd do if I could rewind. I'd ask questions before assuming motives. I'd choose discomfort of being wrong over the comfort of being right. I'd learn that rules are necessary, but love is complicated and quieter. The pergola taught us that everyone, no matter how neat their mailbox, carries a story. If you listen long enough without judgment, you might find that stories are the real structure holding a community together. Or you might find that they pull it apart. Either way, we learned something expensive about the cost of being right.